when we talked with Soren about what he would like for this conference or what we might do, he said, well, do something that's a little bit controversial, or something that's a little sparky. So we talked about doing the shadow, because then we get to talk about rage and lust and greed and fear and unconscious things and so forth, just in case any of that happens in any of your lives. And of course, we live in a culture also that likes to hide the shadow and not pay attention. But let's talk about shadow for a second. Shadow, concept originally introduced in psychological terms by Carl Jung, is that aspect of our life, or we're going to talk about it more collectively, that's hidden away, that we're not aware of, that operates in ways that we ignore or don't pay attention to or deny. You can know parts of your shadow erupting at different times when you have an experience, and then you go home or wherever and you go back and you say, oh, I can't believe I did that again. That there's some part of you that's acting that's not even under your kind of conscious control, and something else happens. And so shadow, when we don't pay attention to the things that are shadowy in our life, when we don't make them conscious, then they rule us. When we begin to turn our attention to them, then it becomes possible for those energies both to become more workable, and they actually liberate us from just acting out of increasing habit. What's really important to understand in terms of human development, and this is quite a mirror to what Ken Wilber likes to talk about in his map of human development, is that I'll use the map, the Buddhist map of the foundations of mindfulness, that it's important for us as we grow and develop as human beings to pay attention or become mindful and aware of our body and our senses, which includes connection with the physical world, of feelings and emotions, of thoughts, and then of our relationships to things. And it turns out in this mandala, or this description of wholeness, that we can be well developed in one area and not in another. This is kind of the description of shadow. So, for example, you can have an Olympic level athlete who's an emotional idiot. You can have a Nobel Prize winning professor of whatever it happens to be who can't find their shoes or their body. You understand what I'm saying? And when we don't realize the importance of paying attention to the different dimensions of our humanity, first, we lose touch with them, but secondly, we also have these kind of idealizations that happen that are really kind of crazy. And I've seen it when I think about shadow as a spiritual professional, if you will, in my industry. I know a lot of swamis and lamas and mamas and, whatever. And it turns out that a certain number of swamis and lamas and mamas, shockingly enough, have misbehaved. We have all read about this, and then you go, how could it be that Zen master, that lama, that whatever, how could they do that? They're supposed to be so enlightened. Well, it turns out that they might be enlightened in certain ways, and in other ways, they're idiots. Or more honorably to say, they're really unconscious, and their shadow gets the best of them. And so you start to see the shadow manifest in different ways. In the spiritual world, on the side of the teachers, I've heard teachers say, well, I'm a master, I'm a lama, I'm a Zen master, so there's no need for me to follow the rules. That's a recipe for you-know-what. Or, I give so much anyway, why shouldn't I also, pluck a little bit of pleasure out of the work that I do or thing. All the kind of rationalizations. But it's not just those spiritual teachers, it can be us as well. We can do a whole spiritual bypass where we think, this is spiritual, and that part doesn't count. Money doesn't count. Sex doesn't count, or those aren't spiritual. Sexuality is, in its essence, profoundly spiritual and beautiful and connects us with this great mystery of being alive. How could it not be? And money is really an exchange of energy, and if you don't take it in a spiritual way and include it, then it starts to rule you. So there's all those kind of spiritual shadows, both for the teachers, but also for the students in their idealization or your ideas about yourself. There are cultural shadows. And probably the best passage that I could read of just a few lines to explain this is from James Baldwin, where he writes, where are you, James? I thought you were here. I imagine one of the reasons that people cling to their hate and prejudice so stubbornly is that they sense that once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with their own pain. And what this means is that if we can't tolerate our insecurity, is there anybody who's not insecure? Please raise your hand. Where things aren't changing and you don't know how it's going to be. It's like Somerset Maugham said, there are 3 rules for writing the great English novel. Unfortunately, no one knows what they are, right? This is our predicament in human incarnation. It's uncertain. So what Baldwin is saying here is if we can't acknowledge and tolerate our uncertainty or our fears, then we project those, that's our shadow, we project them onto the communists, the gays, the immigrants, the Muslims. We have the enemy du jour, the Russians, whoever it happens to be, as a society and as a culture, because we can't look honestly at ourselves and tolerate. So to become aware of shadow is not just a personal thing, but it's also collectively a really profound invitation or question and a necessity for us. And this from Anne Wilson Schaaf, who wrote Society as an Addict. The best adjusted person in our society is the person who's not dead and not alive, just numb, a zombie. When you're dead, you're not able to do any work for the society, but if you're fully alive, you must constantly say no to many of the processes of society, the racism, the polluted environment, the nuclear threat, the arms race, drinking unsafe water, eating carcinogenic foods. Thus, it's in the interest of modern consumer society to promote those things that take the edge off, keep us busy with our fixes, and keep us slightly numbed out and zombie-like. In this way, our modern consumer society itself functions as an addict. You understand that there's a way in which we are being put to sleep in our education and in our commercialism, and that is, again, the shadow of the society. So I'm just naming these things. Cultural shadow, spiritual shadow, business shadow. I remember being teaching, as I have, at a number of different very successful and wonderful high-tech firms. And this firm wanted to imbue mindfulness and compassion throughout the organization, this big company. That's all great. But at the same time, they were growing wildly, they were hiring all the time, and the actual culture is full of ambition, aggression, competition. Okay, let's be mindful and compassionate, but how many hours are you working? What's the payout? How many, whatever it's clients or widgets or how much code or whatever, it was all being measured. And the shadow of it was, we don't want to talk about that. What we want to talk about is mindfulness and compassion. Ha 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 ha. So this is the stuff that we don't want to talk about, and the same in relationship, things that you can't look at in your relationship, whether it's the expectations that aren't spoken, the unconscious things, or the things that people kind of try to maneuver around addiction. Now, at least in our culture, we can talk about addiction in ways we couldn't decades ago. Now we can talk about domestic violence, but when it's there, often it's not talked about, and the aggression and all of those things underneath it. So what is going on in our relationships that we don't talk about and that we can't look at and that's hidden? Now, relationship, business, culture, individual. The other thing to say is that and we're going to take most of our time for questions, so I'll just finish up a couple more things, is that there's also a positive shadow. That is to say, this is from Robert Johnson, a Jungian analyst. He writes that it's difficult for many of us to believe in our own goodness, and the shadow means the things that we don't acknowledge about ourselves. Curiously, people resist the noble aspects of their shadow more strenuously than they hide their dark sides. It's more disruptive to find out you have a profound nobility of character than to find out you're a bum. And so another dimension of the shadow fits together with how much self-judgment we have and that we've learned as human beings in our culture, in our education, in our families. And over these years, Trudy and I have worked together for, practiced together and then worked together for many, many decades. And early on, it became clear that in the spiritual life of the West, there is so much self-hatred and self-judgment. We had this conversation with the Dalai Lama. What do you do about self-hatred? He didn't understand it. Self-hatred? And he went back with his translator. Self-hatred? What could this? There's no word for it in Tibetan. And back and forth conversing. What does this mean? Finally, he got it. He looked at us as teachers, and he said, this is a mistake. Well, thank you. But it turns out that for a wise spiritual life, or a wise human life, that's what's necessary for us is as much self-compassion and self-care, not in a kind of narcissistic way, but in an honorable way. For compassion to be complete, the circle of compassion has to include the well-being of others and the well-being of this one here. And you can ask this simple question, is this compassionate for them and for this one? And when we don't ask that, then again, there's a kind of shadow that's left out. And we don't carry our own integrity and our own self-regard. At Esalen, where I used to teach, they would say the bigger the front, the bigger the back. So the more kind of grandiose someone might seem to be, or you get puffed up to be, more likely the bigger the shadow. So the kind of questions that we want to look at are, what are the shadows in ourselves, in our workplace, in our relationships, and what does it mean to turn toward them and to face whether it's the unspoken things in the relationship or the suffering of the culture or the insecurity of life, and not in an idealistic way. One of the beautiful things about our best teachers, like the Dalai Lama, will say, sometimes I get angry and then I realize what's the use. And he's trying to be human in that. Or we were teaching together with Ram Dass, and he said, oh yeah, I flunked the course a lot of times, and then I start over again. And you hear that common humanity, and you realize that we're in it together, and the idea is not to perfect yourself, but it's really to perfect your compassion and your love. That's really what the game is about. Last passage I'll read from Carl Fried Durkheim, who was a Zen teacher in Europe. He says, the person who really being on the way falls upon hard times in the world will not as a consequence only turn to those friends who offer them refuge and comfort and encourage their old self to survive, but rather they will also seek out those who faithfully and inexorably help them to risk and challenge themselves so that they may endure the difficulty, make it conscious, and pass courageously through it. Only to the extent that a person exposes themselves over and over to annihilation of their ideals, certain things that they carry, can that which is indestructible be found in them. In this daring lies dignity and the spirit of awakening. So our willingness to look at shadow in these different ways, actually there's a kind of gold in it because it wakes us up. Even though there may be tremendous suffering and tremendous difficulty in going through it, it tells you, who are you really? What are your values? Where do you stand? And it gives an integrity to your life.
Thank you, Jack.
Adam.
Thank you. Well, for me, this study of the shadow, it's been intensely personal because I was married for many years, 15 years we were together, to a wonderful, totally gifted, enlightened Zen teacher who had a lit off part of his being that became really problematic for him and wound up actually destroying our family and part of his Sangha too. And so I feel it came out of my own personal agony of how could this happen to us? How could this happen? That somebody so gifted and so awake in so many ways could be unable to embrace and include all of who he is, all of who he was. I call him my husband because today we are friends, we love each other. It was a rough patch, but it was a really rough patch. And it went on for years. And it fueled a kind of strength in my practice to be present with all that, but it was so painful that I really studied this matter. And I go back to not Jung, but Freud was really the one who developed our understanding of the unconscious. And his daughter, Anna Freud, wrote about lines of development. You know, that we can have areas of our personality. I mean, she was really talking about child development. And any of you who've had some, you know that kids don't develop evenly. They can be very precocious in some areas and very regressed in others. And we actually carry those same capacities right into our adult lives. When under stress or emotional, we can regress too. So I'm interested in the unloved, disavowed, set aside, suppressed parts of our being. And I feel like my life work ever since then has been to really try to bring myself and everyone into an experience of self-love that can include all of who we are. And it's not easy because the things that we don't like about ourselves are often, they're hidden from us. And one of the things I love about meditation is that if we sit, how many of you have done a meditation retreat? So quite a few of you. If you haven't and you want to, it's a good thing to do. And in the silence and the steadiness of mindfulness that we're cultivating all the time, but more in a more concentrated way in a retreat, it's true that whatever ideas or fantasies or just images, thoughts about ourselves, beliefs, things that have not been given their day in the sun, they will definitely seek representation and they will emerge from our self-censorship. If we sit long enough, we'll get to see them. So that's really good news about meditation. And I just want to share with you a couple things and then open to you. I found this site when I was studying, very briefly, we didn't have much notice, but for this. And I found a site called Buddhism for Vampires. And yeah, I know, and it's actually a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner who was using the metaphor of the undead to talk about Buddhist teachings. But I loved his description of shadow and what you need to do to find it. And he said there are 5 things you have to do: hunting, chewing, swallowing, digesting, and burning. The hunting is because it's hidden. Blind spots, well, by definition, we don't see them. They're hidden from us. So we have to look. We have to want to see and trust that as that last quote Jack read, that our overarching goodness can handle it, and it can. The chewing is becoming really intimate with ourselves, knowing ourselves so well that we do get to see, and that we take these rejected bits of our reality and we just chew on them and get to know their flavor and taste and what it's like to swallow them. And the swallowing is taking it in, owning it, taking responsibility, feeling, trusting that the doing of that will actually enhance and support our awakening into the fullness of our ability to love and be who we are. That that we don't have to project these things outside of ourselves anymore as not me. Then the digesting, it's the befriending and really saying, okay, I can be familiar with this, and it's not a threat. The digesting is when it changes its consistency, right, from swallowed food to, I don't know, whatever happens in there. And the same happens for us in our psychological, spiritual lives, that as we begin to digest, these things change their consistency from being so unpleasant and so threatening to actually being able to be burned as fuel for our creativity and authenticity. That which we do get to see and know, when the light of awareness is shined on that, it becomes ours. It's not any longer disavowed or denied. So whatever power and energy have been stored, they can bubble up to the surface and be released and enrich our whole life and consciousness. So it sounds great, but it really, this stuff is the shadow stuff. When you see a pattern and you just see it, you have insight, you suddenly see it for the first time, you get this sinking feeling, almost like nausea. And suddenly you see, oh my God, this is all over my life. It's everywhere. But the good news is that when we see one area and work with that, it does generalize to other parts. And the eating of the shadow, I think that's a Jungian term, actually. Eating these rejected aspects of experience. I mean, it sounds gruesome, eating the shadow, but I like that because it's really exhilarating. It's actually exciting. It's good news. It's leading to our freedom from considering our own monstrosity to really seeing, okay, this is just something asking for love, and as revolting, as disgusting as I may find it, the mindfulness and the work of loving awareness of our mindfulness practice, it's so profoundly transformative and healing, gives us so much more energy and life force, aliveness, as Jack was saying. So I just want to mention an aspect of shadow that has been getting lots of attention in the workplace recently, which is implicit bias. And Dr. Durald Wing Su, he invented the term microaggressions to describe the kind of commonplace, daily, verbal, behavioral, environmental indignities, intentional or not, that get communicated and communicate some kind of negative or hostile or derogatory, whether it's racial, gender, sexual orientation, religion, age, body abilities, just little slights or insults. So to be mindful of our language, of who we choose to greet and hang out with and interact with, and who we might ignore, to really look into how we're using our language, our behavior, our word choices, and how they affect the people around us. this is another area it seems more subtle, and it is more subtle, but it's no less important for us to become conscious of. So that's what I wanted to share with you this morning, and also now to welcome your questions or experiences, actually. More, what has this been in your life? What have you learned from your own experiences of yes?
I think, can we have someone run the mic so that people can be heard when they ask a question? Is there a staff person here or someone who's a volunteer who would?
And these are for both of us, just sharing with everybody,
Yeah.
actually.
Oh, okay, thank you. That's great.
So let me start with my question.
You have to hold it close to your mouth,
And you're
like an ice cream cone,
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
very clearly.
So, Trudy, I just want to ask you to expand a little bit about what you said. What you said was beautiful. So you said that the silver bullet there is the loving kindness mindfulness practice. When you see the shadow, when you identify the shadow side about yourself. Can you describe that a little bit more? Because I've been meditating 15 years, and there are certain things that I do see that come up, and there is justification that I have that I do have the bias, and I justify that bias, and
Yeah.
I don't like that about myself. So can you share a little
But
bit
you're
more?
seeing it.
Correct. I am seeing it. I recognize it. But whenever the situation comes up, there is a subconscious bias that, you know what, they are not right. You know, they deserve what's going on to, you know, in the situation. You see this, that.
You know, I think this is where we really need each other, because we can sit alone with ourselves. As you said, you've been sitting for umpteen years and you see things, but then how do you change them? And I think things that happen to us in relationship, that, let's say, beliefs we absorb from our early environment, for example, from our culture, these things I think need to be healed and solved in relationship, talking to others, exploring together. I don't think we can do it all by ourselves. I do think that's why in Buddhist practice there are 3 refuges and not 2. There's Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, community. That's a big piece of it. But you are so well on your way. You are seeing your rationalizations and justifications, and that's huge. So I think you can be really encouraged by that.
And let me just add,
Yes, please.
when you see it, when we look, it's really our common humanity, because anybody who does an honorable meditation practice will see things that they pushed aside, or ways that we, you know, judge ourselves, judge others, get aggressive, all different things that are unpleasant to see. This is part of our human heritage. And the question is not whether you'll find this, but how do you relate to it? Because we're really talking about suffering. And when we talk about shadow, we're talking about cultural suffering, as Trudy was talking about, the racism. We're talking about personal suffering, relational suffering. This is very deep, painful things. But suffering is not the end of the story. We're talking about suffering and the possibility of transforming it. And when we see the suffering, we also can see that this pattern actually doesn't have our best interest in mind. When you begin to see with compassion, you realize this is here, it's self-protective, I've learned it, and then it opens the door to another possibility. So, thank you.
So when you talk about the shadow and when you're exploring the shadow, of course, through your own self-awareness and a loving community is very important to nurture your shadow. But there are thousands and millions of people that have no tolerance for your shadow side whatsoever. And I call these people like scoreboard people, like they're keeping track all the time of your rights and wrongs. But you have to be around them every single day, for example. So how do you manage that, where It's very frustrating to not be heard by people who are keeping score of you, and they never really will ever acknowledge that, hey, it's okay, you've got some strengths and weaknesses. So I really struggle with understanding how to navigate those relationships with people that don't have kind of the loving compassion for your shadow.
What have you discovered that works? What works best in your experience?
Is to do nothing and accept it. But it's very frustrating because you keep trying to prove yourself to them. Like, no, I did this one thing wrong, but I did 6 things right. And they only focus on the things that you do wrong. It happens in work, it happens in personal relationships. So I haven't quite figured out how to navigate those relationships where I feel like I'm being judged for my shadow.
Thank you. I think it helps me to just remember the negativity bias of the brain, that for survival reasons, we're wired to notice the things that are threatening or displeasing or uncomfortable. How many of you remember? I'm just assuming now, I know everybody didn't have, a good childhood with parents who read stories to them at night, and some people had way, way traumatic childhoods. But just think of something very normal, like being tucked in at night. Do you remember all the times you were tucked in or read a story at night? Probably not. Do you remember the time a parent lost their temper and spanked you or hit you or slapped you? Probably. So it helps me to remember that and not take it so personally in terms of my own need to be recognized and appreciated. And you might want to add to that.
I just want to add, I really love the wisdom when you said, well, what I've learned to do is actually to accept it.
Yeah.
And it's painful because you live in a world where there's, sexism and patriarchy, and no matter what you do and how well you do it, you're not seen for who you are. So one part of it is to accept it, and then you said, but it's still frustrating. And so then you also have to accept your frustration, that's natural and there's nothing wrong with that. And it doesn't mean in this acceptance that you can't then work to change it. You can plant seeds, you can speak up in appropriate ways, you can make that something important. But the world is not going to be the way we want it to be. It has a big shadow. And in some way it's going to require your own steadiness, your integrity as you have it, acceptance, and a lot of compassion for yourself and even for the people that are lost.
And you're well on your way. Yeah. Actually, this person right here.
Yeah.
You.
Please.
Thank you for just all your wisdom. So I have a question about the relationship between accountability and compassion, because the piece around cultural shadow and specifically racism. So the relationship between both individual and collective action, compassion, and accountability.
Great
You talk
question.
about that, and I'll do a shameless self-promotion if you're interested in having this conversation more. We're doing a session on sustaining change, Black Lives Matters, and contemplative practice at 4.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's great. Do you want to start?
Well, you can start this time. I'm willing, but...
What I hear from your question and the previous question, I just want us to tune in to the suffering of it. That this is not an easy thing. It's not easy to be in a workplace. I'm just fantasizing where you are and have your boss, or be at a university, and people not see you or regard you or respect you after you've done all this great stuff. And then, when you look at racism and you see people walking around, it's actually kind of the craziest thing you could imagine. What color are you? And then how do I treat you? It's crazy. But it's woven so deeply and in unconscious ways into the culture. And if you're the target of it, it's enormously painful and suffering in micro ways and in widespread and institutional ways. So then your question about compassion and action. Compassion is really a verb, and it implies, or should when it's genuine, an active response. And that differentiates itself. It's helpful now in modern understanding in the study of compassion to differentiate empathy and compassion. Empathy means feeling with someone and, in a sense, resonating with their experience, your mirror neurons, whatever it is neurologically, you get a sense of what that is. But if you only have empathy, it doesn't go anywhere. Compassion is both empathy and then the understanding of that suffering and the desire to somehow respond and take some action or some responsibility to make a difference. And in the neuroscience research that Richie Davidson does up in Madison, Wisconsin, really interesting research, he put a Tibetan Lama who'd done a lot of practice of these kinds in the fMRI and showed him pictures of suffering of refugee camps in Syria and people, all kinds of very traumatic images, and said, first practice empathy. And so certain parts of the brain lit up. And he said, and at the end, how was it? Well, I felt a lot of empathy, but I also feel drained and exhausted. It was so painful to be empathetic with the suffering. He said, all right, now go back in the tube, showed similar images, and said, now do your compassion practice. And even there, without actually being able to get out and do something, he visioned saw the circumstances, felt the empathy, and then felt arise in him, how can I respond? When I get out of here, is there an organization I can help? Is there some way I can contribute? And when he came out, said, how was that? He said, I feel entirely different. I feel empowered and refreshed. So if your compassion is connected with action, it should also then bring you a sense of courage, because although you can't change the whole crazy world, you can do your piece and make a difference. And that is tremendously empowering. When we deal with shadow, we can't change it all, but we can do our part.
To your right.
And I just want to encourage everybody to go to the Black Lives Matter. That's my PS. You know, we're just living in such a white supremacy, and we don't. And how many of us white people think of ourselves as white supremacists, right? It's got a pretty negative connotation. But we can't help it. You know, we just enjoy so much invisible privilege. And so I hope we'll all go to that. Is it this afternoon later? I don't know what.
Okay.
Yes, I think around 4, yeah.
Hi.
Okay.
I've got 2 questions. The first one is, what makes it so difficult to look at the shadow? Why are we so not wanting to see it, although we are anyway suffering? So why are we so afraid of feeling into these feelings? And the second question that I have for you is, coming from Europe, we're facing this horrible and heartbreaking refugee crisis. And we see the same dynamics coming over there, that people start to blame those refugees for unemployment and their whole own frustration. So exactly what you described, this dynamic is happening on an individual and also on this collective basis. And this is what I'm really afraid of currently, this whole dynamic of hatred and blaming others. And what is your idea, what can be done about it? Thank you.
I'll speak to the first part. Why are we so afraid of seeing these unloved, unacceptable parts of ourselves that we might feel are just so shameful or even monstrous? And I think it just comes back to how deeply we need to be loved and to feel love, and from our early longing for love and approval. And from it's necessary that parents socialize their children and teach them to behave in certain ways and not in others. But how kids are taught varies so widely, and I think for most of us, we learn as kids not to do the things that are bad and to then feel like bad people if we do them. So we don't know so well how to separate our thoughts and deeds or our rejected aspects of experience would be a better way of putting it than rejected aspects of the self. But we identify with experience. And so we feel like bad people when we see these things, instead of just, okay, these are aspects of experience we'd rather deny. But it takes a lot of strength and confidence in, I think, one's own capacity to bear that which is difficult to bear, and that we have enough sense of our own goodness to tolerate seeing things we think aren't so good at all. Anyway, that's, and as for the refugees, I don't really know what to say, except that it certainly begins with welcoming the refugees from, within the many beings within our own hearts. And may we never, there's an expression that the highest form of giving is the gift of fearlessness, to not be somebody that anybody else has to be afraid of. And I think we have to look at our own shadow, we're just using that word now, in order to not be somebody that anyone else has to fear. And then, paradoxically, we don't fear others, that they're alien or that they're terrorists or that they're, we actually lose our fear of others. And how to do this on a global scale? Look at how this conference has grown. There were 700 people the first time. I don't know how many people are here now, but thousands. I think this is one way we're doing our best.
I also so appreciate your question, and I think we've just sort of opened the door to this conversation, which is a conversation. It's a deep heart conversation. What are the shadows in ourselves that would serve us to pay attention to? Because when we don't, they bring greater unconsciousness and suffering and repetition of harm. What are the shadows in our workplace? And is there a way, first step, just to acknowledge them, and then perhaps find skillful ways to respond to them? What are the shadows in the culture that we've talked about, whether it's racism or addiction and so forth, or in the global culture of the kind of warfare and lack of care for children, for refugees, for hungry people, and so forth. What's really important is for you to sense in yourself, through your own spiritual practices, which many of you have, or your own inner training, that while there is a vulnerability in us as human beings, we're all vulnerable, it's true, and that sense of vulnerability can harden into what's called the body of fear, some sense of separateness. That also you have within you a nobility and a dignity, as Trudy was talking about. You have these capacities to be a lamp even in difficult times. And you can do that by the way that you carry yourself, even if you can't change all the sexism at work. You can do that by speaking up when you see injustice around you in some way. You can embody integrity. You can embody dignity, and then when you face your own shadow or the shadow around you, first, no matter what happens, you are casting a very different light in the world. And then secondly, from that, sometimes you're able to make skillful changes. Sometimes what you do is bear witness to that suffering with compassion and wait for the time that you can make a difference. But this is really, in some way, an empowerment of us to say, don't be afraid of the shadow. The fact that we don't look, or addiction, or running away, or all those kinds of things will haunt us. And we have the capacity in ourselves, and also to see it in another. Nelson Mandela said, it never hurts to see the good in another. They often act the better because of it. And there's some way in which, when you carry that integrity, and then you begin to look at the world through those eyes, see the suffering of it, and also see that there's another possibility, you become the agent of change. Last question.
Yeah.
Is it on? Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to zoom in a little bit to the process of from chewing to digesting that you mentioned. I think it's a process from seeing the most ugly part of ourselves and realize how beautiful it can be. To a very big extent, it sounds very personal to me because it involves a lot of revealing vulnerabilities. But my question is, how do we involve other people and engage other people in this process to help us and also benefit other people in the process of formation?
So I think that's a beautiful question, and I think we do it according to our abilities, talents, strengths, interests. For example, we teach mindfulness as a way of bringing more understanding, awareness, love. And I would urge everybody, look at your shadows so that you aren't judging other people so much, because part of the problem is there's too much shame to bring these things to light. My husband suffered from an addiction, and when he was using, he did really scary, bad things. But there was so much shame around admitting it and getting help because of the judgment and criticisms that we hold of each other. So to begin to, as much as we possibly can, comes back to your question about accepting the frustrations, accepting the non-acceptance, accepting the judgments and criticisms that we have, so that we can become people around whom it's safe to explore our shadow and have even conversations, bring it out into the open, which I think people are trying to do more in workplaces in terms of implicit bias. And I think our culture is moving more in this direction, and that each one of us have a part to play. Yeah.
I think that we've used the time that we have and feel like this is just an invitation for our own mindfulness, our own reflection, our own loving awareness. And to learn to trust that you as a human being have the capacity to face both the beauty of the world, the unbearable beauty of this world, and its measure of tears with a wise heart. Dina Metzger, who's a poet friend, writes, "Give me everything mangled and bruised, and I will make a light of it to make you weep. And we will have rain, and we will begin again." And I think that's what's asked of us, to plant beautiful seeds, sometimes even in the desert, to turn to things that are difficult in ourselves, shame, mangled, bruised, whatever they be, and plant the seeds of loving attention and care, and something can grow of it. So really is an act of courage.
Yeah, I want to quote one of my teachers. Around this time of turmoil in my life, I went and sat a 3-month meditation retreat, and I was so full of kind of righteous indignation and outrage when I went into the retreat, and I was trying to enlist my teachers on my side. Who we were talking about the rationalizations and justifications, so I was definitely trying to enlist that kind of slightly unsavory support. And I was talking to Joseph, and this and this and this. And he just looked at me and said, "People do things." And so do we. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. When we talked with Soren about what he would like for this conference or what we might do, he said, well, do something that's a little bit controversial, or something that's a little sparky. So we talked about doing the shadow, because then we get to talk about rage and lust and greed and fear and unconscious things and so forth, just in case any of that happens in any of your lives. And of course, we live in a culture also that likes to hide the shadow and not pay attention. But let's talk about shadow for a second. Shadow, concept originally introduced in psychological area and not in another. This is kind of the description of shadow. So, for example, you can have an Olympic level athlete who's an emotional idiot. You can have a Nobel Prize winning professor of whatever it happens to be who can't find their shoes or their body. You understand what I'm saying? And when we don't realize the importance of paying attention to the different dimensions of our humanity, first, we lose touch with them, but secondly, we also have these kind of idealizations that happen that are really kind of crazy. And I've seen it when I think about shadow as a spiritual professional, if you will, in my industry. I know a lot of swamis and lamas and mamas and, you know, whatever. And it turns out that a certain number of swamis and lamas and mamas, shockingly enough, have misbegotten to them. Then it becomes possible for those energies both to become more workable, and they actually liberate us from just acting out of increasing habit. What's really important to understand in terms of human development, and this is quite a mirror to what Ken Wilber likes to talk about in his map of human development, is that I'll use the map, the Buddhist map of the foundations of mindfulness, that it's important for us as we grow and develop as human beings to pay attention or become mindful and aware of our body and our senses, which includes connection with the physical world, of feelings and emotions, of thoughts, and then of our relationships to things. And it turns out in this mandala, or this description of wholeness, that we can be well developed in one area by Carl Jung, is that aspect of our life, or we're going to talk about it more collectively, that's hidden away, that we're not aware of, that operates in ways that we ignore or don't pay attention to or deny. You can know parts of your shadow erupting at different times when you have an experience, and then you go home or wherever and you go back and you say, oh, I can't believe I did that again. That there's some part of you that's acting that's not even under your kind of conscious control, and something else happens. And so shadow, when we don't pay attention to the things that are shadowy in our life, when we don't make them conscious, then they rule us. When we begin to turn our attention, behaved. We have all read about this, and then you go, how could it be that Zen master, that Lama, that whatever, how could they do that? They're supposed to be so enlightened. Well, it turns out that they might be enlightened in certain ways, and in other ways, they're idiots. Or more honorably to say, they're really unconscious, and their shadow gets the best of them. And so you start to see the shadow manifest in different ways. In the spiritual world, from on the side of the teachers, I've heard teachers say, well, I'm a master, I'm a Lama, I'm a Zen master, so there's no need for me to follow the rules. That's a recipe for you know what. Or, I give so much anyway, why shouldn't I also, you know, pluck a little bit of pleasure out of the work that I do or think. All the kind of rationalization